A letter showed up from my ex-wife, the one who had betrayed me. Her words were dripping with fake sentimentality, enough to make me feel sick. It started like this: Dear Ethan, sitting here trying to sort out my thoughts. I'm overwhelmed by emotions. Leaving you wasn't a simple decision. At least that's what I keep telling myself. Please don't take this as an attempt to place blame or harbor resentment. It's about confronting the changes within me and being truthful for both of us. The years we spent together were filled with laughter, joy, and memories I'll always cherish. From the sparks in the beginning to building a life as a couple, we faced life's challenges and celebrated its victories. But somewhere in the grind of daily life, I lost myself. This isn't about you or your worth. It's about me realizing I've neglected my own dreams, desires, and identity. I tied who I was to us and forgot who I used to be. Reading that, I could almost hear her rehearsed tone. Every sentence felt like a thinly veiled excuse. This letter is my attempt at honesty, Ethan. I couldn't bear to see the heartbreak in your eyes or hear it in your voice while explaining all this. Dragging it out wouldn't be fair to either of us. I hope someday you'll understand. You deserve real happiness, with someone who can love you without hesitation. I wish you nothing but peace and fulfillment. You'll always mean something special to me, but I've come to a realization I need to share. This might come off as selfish because it is, but I feel restless. I miss the thrill of something new, the excitement of falling in love. I can't find that with us anymore. There was a time when you were magnetic, irresistible even. You swept me off my feet with your guitar playing, your Harley rides, and the way you owned the dance floor. Whether it was a grungy bar or a ballroom, you had me completely. You even painted portraits of me and the kids. But life changed. The gigs stopped, you sold the bike for a coaching job, and that once rebellious Harley is buried in the garage under a pile of soccer gear. Sure, you've still got your golden hair, but I can't keep up anymore. And now that the kids are grown, I feel trapped in this minivan existence you've settled into. What a performance. She kept the blame just out of reach, yet every word hit like a backhanded slap. I need to be honest. I haven't cheated on you, not physically. You're the only man I've ever been with, but I've caught myself feeling drawn to others. Before anything crossed a line, I knew I had to end things. I couldn't lie to you or sneak around. I loved you too much for that, even if I don't love you the way I once did. I don't want to have this conversation face to face, so I've asked Jack to handle the divorce. The paperwork's ready. You'll keep everything but my personal belongings, which I've already taken. I'm splitting my pension and the debts except the mortgage. I think that's fair since we shared expenses. Please grieve quietly. Let's avoid making family events awkward. If you want to respond, send me a letter. I'll read it. With love, Rachel. I read that letter over and over, standing dumbfounded in the kitchen where I'd found it. No tears came, not right away. I was too numb. There had been no warning signs, no complaints, no conversations about her unhappiness, not a hint of anyone else in her life. She'd kissed me, held my hand, and smiled like nothing was wrong. Just last year, I went out of my way to reignite our romance. Bought her jewelry, only to be scolded for spending too much. Chocolates would have been better, she said. I even stopped initiating intimacy, thinking I was pressuring her. She reassured me that holding hands was enough. Maybe that should have clued me in, but I shrugged it off as us growing older. I stood there, blindsided. Then I grabbed a beer and headed straight for the shower. I drank it under the hot water. And then another, and another. I didn't care about the water flooding the floor, her floor. I had a stash of beer that I used to treat like a collector's wine. That night, I cracked open bottle after bottle without a second thought. I didn't even put a dent in my stock, but I drank enough to feel it. The next morning, I woke up on the basement floor, half-dressed, with a splitting headache. I dragged myself to the bathroom, vomited every drop of beer I'd drunk, and collapsed into bed. That's when the tears finally came. I remembered what my grandpa told me at my grandmother's funeral when I was a kid. You get 3 days to grieve, Ethan. God took 3 days to bring the dead back to life, and you'll need 3 days to bring yourself back, too. Cry, scream, pray, and if you're old enough, have a drink or throw a punch. Then move on. His words played on repeat in my head as I stared at the ceiling. I wondered if 3 days would be enough for this kind of heartache. Grandpa always said to honor the people who leave us by focusing on the life we're building, not the one we've lost. That was the only thing keeping me from falling apart completely. For days I let myself go. I cried until I had no tears left. I drowned my sorrows in beer and took my anger out on the house. My fists slammed into walls until they bled, and I trashed furniture just to feel something other than betrayal. I yelled at no one, kicked things, and drank like the answers to my pain were hidden at the bot jack of a bottle. Eating didn't seem worth it, so I convinced myself beer was liquid bread. And wine? That was fruit, right? Between the two, I managed to check off the food groups. She picked her timing well. Rachel waited until the school year ended, leaving me the entire summer to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. By the next Tuesday, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let Rachel wreck more than she already had. Enough was enough. The first step was reaching out to my kids. Turns out, Rachel had already told them, and they'd been trying to call me for days. I'd been too drunk to answer. I reassured them, or at least tried to, saying I was fine, or as fine as I could be under the circumstances. Once that was done, I threw myself into action. I scrubbed the house from top to bottom, gathering mountains of things to donate. I wasn't about to cling to the relics of a failed marriage. Family heirlooms stayed, along with photos and albums for the kids. But the rest? Trash. The Spanish pottery she adored? Gone. Those brass cats she picked up in Portugal? Out the door. Before long, I was making near-daily trips to Home Depot. I stocked up on flooring, paint, and sheetrock. It was time to rebuild my house into something that felt like mine. The pink walls and coral accents Rachel had insisted on? History. The frilly curtains? Torched. I wanted my home to reflect me, not the leftovers of a life that had been ripped away. I swung by Jack's office, signed the divorce papers, and was out of there in minutes. Jack said it would be finalized before the school year started since it was uncontested. Knowing it would all be done soon gave me a sense of relief I hadn't felt in weeks. Then I did something just for me. I sold the minivan, a grim symbol of the life she'd abandoned me in, and traded it for something that made me feel alive again. A '76 Triumph Spitfire convertible in British racing green, complete with beige leather seats and chromed wire wheels. It was a car I dreamed of owning, and seeing it parked in my driveway made me grin like I hadn't in ages. Clearing out the garage stopped feeling like a chore. It became a mission. With all the clutter gone, the Harley finally had its rightful place again, center stage. But the best decision I made that day was picking up the phone and calling Sam. Sam wasn't just a friend, he was family. We'd been thick as thieves since the 3rd grade, starting a band, playing sports, and even double dating back in the day. He was my best man and I'd been his. When I told him what had happened, he was at my door in less than 30 minutes. And he wasn't alone. The band showed up too. Music had been a huge part of my life before responsibilities took over. We'd played at weddings, funerals, block parties, sometimes for peanuts, sometimes for nothing, just because we loved it. And it seemed like our community hadn't forgotten us either. Word spread fast about my renovations. Soon, it wasn't just my friends helping out. Painters, carpenters, masons, and plumbers I hadn't seen in years came by to lend a hand. The house wasn't just being repaired, it was being transformed. And where there are guys fixing up a house, women aren't far behind. Wives, girlfriends, and even a few single friends started stopping by. Someone jokingly called it Project Ethan's Love Life. Nobody was pushing me into anything, but I could see the wheels turning in their heads. Suddenly, I was out 2 or 3 nights a week, dancing, socializing, and hosting barbecues. My house became a hub of activity, and for the first time in a long time, I felt surrounded by people who genuinely cared. Still, I wasn't about to dive into a new relationship before the ink on the divorce was dry. Sam, however, had other plans. He suggested we get the band back together, and before I could object, he'd already lined up a few gigs. By the time the fresh paint on the walls dried, we were back on stage, headlining Friday nights at Jimmy's and Saturdays at a cozy club downtown. Sundays were reserved for acoustic sets at a waterfront seafood joint. Felt like we'd never stopped. Old fans crawled out of the woodwork, packing every venue we played. Even my sons pitched in, helping with the renovations and occasionally jamming with the band. I made it clear they weren't to give Rachel any details about my life. If she asked, the story was simple. Dad was upset at first but moving forward. I gave my daughter, who was living in Australia with her fiancé, the same instructions. I trusted my kids completely. They knew what to share and, more importantly, what to keep private. If Rachel wanted out, she didn't get to keep tabs on the life she'd walked away from. And, let me tell you, my life was shaping up just fine. To keep loneliness at bay, I threw myself into new routines. I overhauled my diet, ramped up my workouts, and pushed myself to grow stronger, physically and mentally. I'd always stayed in decent shape, but now I attacked my fitness with purpose. I spent my mornings running or cycling, and my evenings alternating between weightlifting and swimming laps. By the time I headed out for a gig, I'd poured every ounce of pent-up energy into sculpting the best version of myself. A month after Rachel left, my life was unrecognizable. The house was mine again, rebuilt to reflect who I was. My social calendar was buzzing. My bond with my kids was stronger than ever. My body felt younger, and my nights were alive with music. It seemed only fitting to close the door she'd left open with her letter. So I wrote back, "Dear Rachel, thank you. You were right. Goodbye, Ethan." I sent the email without a second thought. It was short, but it said everything that needed to be said. I didn't bother asking for her new address. I didn't want it. Rumors about her eventually found their way to me. Something about a younger guy, a flashy car, and whirlwind weekends at the shore. Whenever someone tried to fill me in, I'd cut them off. It wasn't my business. Grandpa's 3-day rule had carried me through the worst, and I was too focused on the man I was becoming to waste time on her or the life she chose. As summer wound down, the start of the school year loomed ahead. For teachers, August always brings a bittersweet mix of squeezing in the last bits of freedom and gearing up for routine. But this year, I faced it with a sense of hope I hadn't felt in ages. By August, my calendar was overflowing with gigs, music festivals, street fairs, and everything in between. Sam and I were on a roll, sometimes playing 2 or 3 sets in a single day. Labor Day weekend was a blur of music, crowds, and excitement, leaving me with little time or interest to check my email. If Rachel had responded to my short message, I hadn't noticed. It wasn't deliberate. I simply didn't care. She'd made her choices, and I'd made mine. Life was too good to waste on what-ifs and unread emails. Then, out of nowhere, Jack called with some unexpected news. Our divorce had been expedited. Apparently, one of our fans, a court clerk with connections to the family court judge, helped fast-track the process. By Friday, I'd officially be single again. That Friday just so happened to be the day of a massive arts festival and street fair where we were performing. The streets were packed, the atmosphere electric. As we took the stage, I couldn't help but notice the women in the crowd. Short skirts, plunging necklines, and no longer off-limits. We cranked up the amps and launched into our set, mixing gritty blues covers with original tracks. The crowd ate it up, dancing and cheering with every riff and beat. Even some old recordings, hastily burned onto makeshift CDs, sold like crazy at the merch table. The attention from women didn't go unnoticed, either. Their looks, some coy, others bold, made it clear that I was finally ready to break my self-imposed dry spell. In the post-show chaos, I didn't notice Rachel lingering in the crowd. I also missed her attempt to sneak backstage as I loaded my guitar onto the rack of my Harley, the Cuzjack setup I'd built years ago. What I did notice was Sophia, a stunning blonde in her 30s, who climbed onto the back of the bike. For the first time in 25 years, someone else took that seat. I revved the engine and roared off with Sophia behind me, completely oblivious to the tear that slipped down Rachel's cheek as she watched us leave. I wish I'd seen it, not because I'd have done anything differently, but because it would have felt damn good. Sophia was incredible. I'll spare you the details, but let's just say that night reminded me what it felt like to be alive. The connection we shared was fiery and intense, but by morning, she made it clear she wasn't looking for anything long-term. I respected that. It had been an unforgettable night, and I wasn't going to cling to something that wasn't meant to last. Still, I couldn't avoid Rachel forever. Our paths inevitably crossed again at Jimmy's during one of our usual Friday night gigs. She walked in with her new boyfriend, a slick-looking guy, and another couple. They grabbed a table, ordered drinks, and settled in. The second I saw her, I gave Sam the signal. We were switching up the set list. Our band had a tradition. If an ex of one of the guys showed up, we'd play American Woman, our way of sending a not-so-subtle message. Dating a Sam's ex was a hard no in our group, and the song became our unofficial anthem of solidarity. I started the opening riff, slow and soulful like the Lenny Kravitz version. Something about the song hit differently that night, and I poured every ounce of emotion into it. The crowd loved it, feeding off the energy, and the band followed my lead with equal intensity. I didn't need to see Rachel's reaction to know it hit home. Sam's wife filled me in later. She said Rachel's face fell the moment she realized the song was aimed at her. Tears welled up in her eyes as I sang lines like, "Stay away from me," and "Go on and let me be," with raw, unfiltered emotion. Rachel left before the song ended, barely keeping it together. Her boyfriend and their friends, however, stayed behind, drinking and dancing like nothing had happened. It was obvious that her new paradise wasn't as perfect as she wanted it to seem. A week later, my eldest son stopped by with some interesting news. Apparently, that night at Jimmy's, Rachel and her boy toy had a massive argument. He'd grown tired of her inability to keep up with his lifestyle, both in the bedroom and out. On top of that, he was annoyed that she refused to visit venues where we played. The band's revival had become the talk of the town, and avoiding us meant missing some of the area's best entertainment. The final straw? He found out she'd given up her claim to the house in the divorce. Word on the street was that Rachel had planned to move back in, probably with him in tow. I'd always suspected he was a gold digger, but his brazen entitlement still managed to surprise me. What he clearly didn't know was that her father had insisted on a prenuptial agreement when we got married. The terms were simple. If either of us left the marriage for someone else, we forfeited all rights to family assets. Everything would go to the other party. I hadn't hesitated to sign it. Rachel, on the other hand, must have remembered that little detail, which explained why she'd been so cooperative during the divorce. Her boyfriend, though, was blindsided. When he kicked her out, Rachel spent the night pouring her heart out to our kids over the phone. I felt a twinge of sympathy, but my 3 days of mourning were long behind me. I had no lingering attachment to her, which made it easy to offer polite support without getting emotionally tangled. My kids, however, weren't thrilled with my detached attitude. They thought I should let Rachel move back into the house temporarily to help her get back on her feet. I wasn't interested. Taking her in would have meant dealing with her menopausal mood swings, the sting of her rejection, and the humiliation she'd likely feel crawling back. I wasn't about to let her disrupt the peace I'd worked so hard to rebuild. Eventually, my kids dropped the idea and shifted to a more reasonable request. Could they access the storage unit where I'd stashed the furniture and belongings she might need? I agreed, even letting them borrow the band's truck to haul it. With the new school year underway and my gig schedule packed, my run-ins with Rachel became few and far between. We still worked in the same district, but in separate buildings, which kept our paths from crossing too often. And honestly, that suited me just fine. Even on the rare occasions Rachel and I crossed paths, I hardly noticed her. Meanwhile, I'd somehow become the topic of every whispered conversation in the school hallways. Maybe it was the Harley, the convertible, or the rumors of my active social life. Whatever the reason, it didn't matter to me. Life was great. The band was thriving. My legendary barbecues were always packed with laughter and good company, and I had no shortage of female attention. I didn't miss being married one bit. Thanksgiving brought another milestone. 4 years. I dreamed of spending the holiday in France, celebrating the release of Beaujolais Nouveau. This year, it all came together perfectly. My bags were packed when my son called the night before my flight, asking if I'd join the family for Thanksgiving dinner at Rachel's. When I told him I already had plans, He sounded disappointed but quickly pivoted to another idea. A family Christmas at my house. He and his girlfriend offered to handle the cooking, and all 3 kids would be in town for the first time in years. I agreed, but I laid down one condition. Rachel couldn't bring a date. I wanted the focus to be on the kids, without any unnecessary tension. That's when he surprised me. Rachel wasn't seeing anyone. In fact, she was lonely. I didn't press for details. Her love life didn't interest me. My goal was to create a harmonious holiday, not stir up old drama. I told the kids they could stay as long as they wanted, but my son raised a concern. What if Rachel felt uncomfortable leaving while everyone else stayed behind? That gave me pause. This would be the first time we'd all gathered under one roof since the kids had moved out. And as much as I valued my independence, I couldn't deny that Rachel was still part of the family, at least for this occasion. Fine, I said finally. Invite her to stay, but she'll have to settle for the guest room. There's no way she's sleeping in her old bedroom. It just doesn't feel right. I added one more rule. If anyone brought a guest, they'd need to share a room or find a hotel. Thanks, Dad, my son said, relief in his voice. This really means a lot to all of us. Christmas fell on a Saturday that year, but the celebration started Thursday night as everyone began to arrive. My daughter and her fiancé flew in from Australia, my older son and his girlfriend drove down from Boston, and they picked up my youngest from college on the way. Rachel arrived about 10 minutes before the others. She sat in her car for a while, clearly nervous, while I watched from the window. When the family finally gathered in the front yard, hugging and laughing, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, a flicker of sentimentality. It was a sight I hadn't realized I'd missed. As everyone walked through the door, they were greeted by a warm, festive atmosphere. Rachel and my daughter hadn't seen the remodeled house yet, and their surprised expressions said it all. Despite the renovations, I'd held onto our Christmas traditions. Candles, nutcrackers, and festive centerpieces adorned the new furniture. The Christmas tree stood in its usual corner, decorated with ornaments from family vacations and handmade treasures from the kids' school days. The centerpiece of the room was the fireplace I'd installed during the renovations. Its crackling fire cast a cozy glow, filling the air with the scent of pine and mulled cider. Plates of cookies and fudge were scattered around, and the dining table was set with the fine china Rachel's grandmother had given us as a wedding present. The house was undeniably mine now, but it remained a place that welcomed family. No matter how old the kids got, they were still my children. And Rachel, despite everything, had been a significant part of my life for decades. The kids buzzed with excitement as they explored the house. I'd restored their childhood bedrooms, updating them to reflect their adult tastes. My daughter's hot pink walls were replaced with a soft pastel, and all the single beds had been upgraded to queens. Their old desks and dressers remained, giving the rooms a familiar feel. The guest room was now my studio, complete with a drafting table, instruments, and recording gear. The library had expanded into a game room with a TV and pool table. The living room, centered around the new fireplace, featured stockings for everyone, including Rachel. When the kids spotted their stockings, they rushed over with the same excitement they had as children. For a moment, they were carefree again, laughing and sharing memories. Even my older two, showing some maturity, grabbed stockings for their partners and reminisced about Christmases past. One of them noticed something. "Dad, your stocking is empty. We didn't know what to put in it." I smiled as I reached for it. "No, it's full," I said. "You're all here, laughing and reminiscing. That's the best gift I could ask for." There were hugs and kisses all around, and even Rachel held onto her hug a little longer than expected. For a brief moment, it felt like we were one big happy family again. The tree became the next focus as we exchanged gifts, bringing back memories of childhood Christmas mornings. Dinner was a feast, and after the dishes were cleared, we kept the tradition alive with a Christmas jam session. As the night wound down, everyone retreated to their rooms. Rachel grabbed her coat and approached me. "Thank you for today," she said quietly. "It means so much to spend Christmas with you and the kids. I know I have no one to blame but myself, but I really miss the family time." I nodded. The kids are grown and busy with their own lives. They won't always have time for this. I'm glad we could all be together. Gatherings like this would be rare, even if we were still married, I said, trying to ground the conversation. Rachel gave me a wistful look, her eyes softening. I know, she admitted. But I miss the time when it was just the two of us. As a couple. I guess this is my way of finally apologizing. I ruined what could have been an amazing life for both of us. Her tone was sincere, and for a moment, I felt the weight of her regret. Don't be so hard on yourself, I said gently. We always encourage the kids to follow their dreams, to find their happiness. You just did the same for yourself. We've built fulfilling lives, they're just different now. Her expression shifted, her brows knitting together. So, you're saying you don't value what we had? After today, you don't feel any nostalgia? Any regret for what we've lost? I sighed, trying to choose my words carefully. Rachel, we had today, and it was wonderful. What do you think we've lost? Her voice cracked, and tears spilled down her face. We lost each other. I lost you, and I'll never forgive myself for it. And it seems like you couldn't care less. Her sobs shook her shoulders as she broke down in front of me. Without thinking, I wrapped an arm around her, letting her cry against me. I'd cried my tears over her long ago, but seeing her like this on Christmas night stirred something bittersweet. It was a reminder of everything we'd had, and everything we'd lost. When she finally calmed down, I reminded her of something from our college days, when she ended things between us because she felt things were moving too fast. She'd needed space to figure out if she was ready for a lifelong commitment. I told you back then how much it hurt, I said, but I couldn't be with someone who wasn't sure about me. After the divorce, I gave myself the same mourning period just like I had back then. And when those days were up, I embraced the new chapter in my life. I've moved forward, but that doesn't mean I don't value what we had. You'll always be a part of my life, Rachel. I'm grateful for that. The words seemed to steady her. I set up the studio bed for her, leaving her with one of my t-shirts and a robe. As I locked up the house, I heard her quietly crying and doubted she'd get much sleep. I, on the other hand, slept soundly. The next morning felt like a continuation of Christmas. The kids and I convinced Rachel to stay for the weekend, and she seemed genuinely happy to do so. While the kids were around, we kept things light, steering clear of the heavier topics. But I couldn't ignore the subtle, familiar ways Rachel acted toward me. The lingering looks, the warm smiles, the casual touches on my arm. It was like muscle memory for both of us. Without thinking, I found myself responding to her gestures the way I used to. At breakfast, we slipped into old routines. She poured my coffee just the way I liked it, and I added the perfect splash of milk to hers. I buttered my pancakes, and she drizzled the right amount of syrup. We even finished each other's sentences. But at the end of the day, we respected the boundaries we'd set, retreating to separate rooms. When the kids left for a road trip to Boston and Vermont, Rachel and I were alone in the house we once shared. I stoked the fire while she opened a bottle of wine. That evening, we laughed over old memories, reminiscing about happier times. Eventually, the conversation turned to heavier topics. I acted so foolishly, she began, her voice trembling. Selfishly, cruelly. I know I can never make up for what I've done, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to know how sorry I am. You weren't just my husband, you were my best friend, my confidant, my partner in crime. And I miss every part of you more than I can put into words. Her confession was raw, and it hit me hard. She talked at length, laying everything bare. She described how boredom had crept into her life, how she had created the void she blamed me for. She admitted the thrill of meeting a younger man and the lies she told herself to justify it. She confessed to painting me as the villain when, deep down, she knew she was the one acting selfishly. What struck me most was her anger at herself for making the choices she did. She was furious I hadn't fought for her, hadn't tried to stop her from leaving. Her jealousy boiled over when she saw me rebuilding my life. Seeing another woman on the back of my Harley enraged her. Her younger lover, she revealed, had a pattern of chasing married women until they left their husbands, only to discard them. When their relationship ended, she hit rock bottom. The dating pool, she said, was nothing like she'd expected. Men her age were either unavailable or uninterested in someone with her history. Younger men enjoyed her charm but had no intention of building a future with her. I let her speak until she ran out of words. Then I poured us both another glass of wine. Handing her the glass, I said with a small smile, "Sounds like you made some pretty foolish choices, but you don't owe me anything. You followed your desires, and I loved you enough to let you go." Her face softened, tears brimming in her eyes. She seemed caught off guard by my response. "I forgave you almost immediately," I continued. "How could I keep you in a marriage you didn't want? If I tried to stop you, you'd have resented me, or worse, lied and done it anyway. Your letter may have been harsh, but it saved us a lot of trouble. No property disputes.
No custody battles.
Honestly, I should thank you for that." Her lip quivered, and she wiped at her eyes. "So I'm no longer your husband," I said gently. "And it might take time for us to be best friends again. But if you want my advice, that label is yours to define. Partners in crime might be too romantic for where we are now. How about we just call ourselves friends?" She melted into my embrace, her tears flowing freely. That night, she stayed again, but we kept things respectful. We slept in separate rooms, maintaining the boundaries we'd carefully rebuilt. We had years to catch up on, and for the first time, it felt like we were finally finding our way back to a place of mutual understanding. Sharing the role of parenting again, even with our grown kids, felt strange yet comforting. We weren't who we once were, but perhaps we could become something new. The next day, Rachel left to pack for a New Year's trip with the kids in Boston, and I buried myself in gigs. New Year's week was a whirlwind for musicians, and by the time the school term resumed, Rachel had barely crossed my mind. Our next encounter was at an in-service conference in April. By chance, we ended up sitting together during sessions and later shared lunch. Conversation came easily, mostly centered on our daughter's upcoming wedding in Australia. As lunch wound down, Rachel surprised me. "Thank you," she said shyly, "for treating me so well, at Christmas and even now. It means a lot." "Of course," I replied with a smile. Then she hesitated, her cheeks coloring slightly. "Would you take me for a ride on the Harley one Saturday? It's been so long." Her request caught me off guard, but I responded quickly. "Sunday's looking perfect. Let's ride north, grab lunch, and enjoy the fresh air." Her excitement was obvious, and the ride brought back old memories. Her hands on my waist, the way she used to press against me as we sped along. We stopped at the falls, walked trails, and strolled through antique shops, something I usually avoided but found enjoyable with her. Lunch was relaxed and full of laughter, and we capped the day with a seafood dinner by the water. The candlelight, the waves, and the easy conversation made it clear this wasn't just any day. When I brought her home, our home, it felt natural. For the first time in years, we made love, slipping into a familiar intimacy that hadn't faded. It was as though we were rediscovering parts of ourselves that had been lost. Over the following weeks, we saw each other regularly, dinners, movies, and casual outings. Though we ended each night in bed, we didn't discuss exclusivity or labels. We were simply enjoying each other's company. As the wedding drew closer, Rachel and I coordinated details meticulously. I paid for everything without hesitation, ensuring the day would be perfect for our daughter. Financially, I was comfortable with the mortgage long paid off and little debt. One thing we hadn't planned was our travel arrangements. When we compared notes, we realized we'd booked the same flight to Sydney. I suggested she meet at my house so we could share the car to the airport. On the morning of the trip, she arrived early, and we checked our bags together. At the counter, I learned she was in coach while I'd booked first class. When the attendant offered an upgrade for her to sit with me, I accepted immediately. Flying across the world while she was cramped in coach didn't sit right with me. When Rachel saw the first-class seat beside me, her face lit up. "Mother of the bride perks," I joked. "You're sentimental, you know that?" she said, smiling softly. "Maybe," I replied, "but it feels right, doesn't it?" She didn't answer, but her smile said everything. For the first time in years, it felt like we were on the same journey literally and figuratively. The flight was comfortable, and while I'll admit thoughts of the Mile High Club crossed my mind, I kept them at bay. Public displays of affection were never my style. Besides, I didn't need the embarrassment of being escorted off a plane. Once we landed in Sydney, the week felt like a dream. The city's energy was infectious, and as a family, we explored its sights and landmarks. But the highlight was the wedding itself. Walking our daughter down the aisle was one of the proudest moments of my life. When I said, "Her mother and I do," it hit me. Despite everything that had happened between Rachel and me, we had built something extraordinary. That day belonged to our daughter, but it also reminded me of the family we'd created and the memories we'd share forever. At the reception, I escorted Rachel for the traditional dances, savoring the warmth of her hand in mine. One of the night's highlights came when her brothers and I joined the band for a rendition of All-American Girl, a tribute to my little girl, now a married woman. Guests cheered, laughed, and cried. A moment I'll treasure forever. Later, Rachel, the boys, and I gathered in the hotel lounge, enjoying an easy camaraderie. The mood shifted when one of my sons narrowed his eyes and asked, "So, what's going on with you two?" Rachel answered smoothly, "Nothing new, sweetie. Your dad and I are embracing our roles as your parents. We've moved on and are enjoying life. Is that okay with you?" "It just seems like more than that," he pressed. "Are you getting back together?" Rachel didn't flinch. "I made a foolish mistake and I own it," she said. "Your dad and I have talked about it. We taught you to make your choices and live with the consequences. I made mine and I'm living with it." Their eyes turned to me. I took a slow sip of my ale before answering. "Boys, you should be grateful we've made it through this week without throwing sharp words or awkward silences at each other. That's more than most divorced parents manage. Beyond that, let me remind you, my romantic life is off limits. Didn't I raise you not to kiss and tell?" They weren't satisfied. "Dad, you love Mom. It's obvious. Just tell us? Are you more than friends?" I leaned back, thoughtful. "Even being friendly with your mom surpasses most definitions of friendship. She's the love of my life, the mother of my kids, and my greatest friend. You don't just turn that off. But where we go from here, that part of the story hasn't been written yet." The boys exchanged knowing looks, and we moved on to lighter topics. But later, as I settled into bed, there was a knock at the door. It was Rachel. She slipped in quietly and climbed into bed beside me. "Thank you," she whispered, "for the upgrade, the week, what you said to the boys. Thank you for everything." Her gratitude flowed freely, and I barely kept up. By the time we fell asleep, I realized just how deeply it all meant to her. The next morning, we shared room service breakfast, chatting about the trip and the memories we'd made. The flight home was quiet, both of us lost in thought. When we pulled into my driveway, Rachel lingered. Without warning, she leaned in and kissed me. "I want you to know I'm here for you," she said, her voice trembling. "Whatever you need, whenever you need it." Somewhere along the way, I forgot why I loved you. Leaving you was the biggest mistake of my life. Her words hit hard. "I'll never expect exclusivity, but if you want it, the answer will always be yes. Friend, girlfriend, lover, wife, whatever you need, just ask. And if you find someone else, I'll be happy for you. But I'll always be here, waiting." "That's sweet of you, Rachel," I replied, keeping my tone steady. "I've been happy reconnecting, but I'm not ready to put labels on us. For the first time in my life, I'm calling the shots. My house, my band, my freedom. I'm not ready to change that." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "Do you remember the note you left me after I left?" she asked softly.
I do, he replied.
"I thanked you, said you were right, and said goodbye. I meant it. And what needs to be said now?" "Nothing," I said simply. "I've shown you everything you need to know." Tears welled in her eyes as she kissed me goodnight. "You've shown me so much," she whispered. "That you care, that you still find me attractive, that you want me. The only thing missing is a more permanent role in your life, but I'll never push for it. Just know, if you ever ask, the answer is yes." After she left, I sat reflecting on her words. There was comfort in the idea of sharing my golden years with Rachel, but I wasn't ready to settle down. Not yet. That night, I called the blonde who had been my first post-divorce fling. She laughed when I reminded her of her promise to keep the door open. When she invited me over, I revved up the Harley and hit the road. Someday I might propose to Rachel again, but not today. Today, my life was exactly where I wanted it to be.